Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of our new series, Bringing Data to Life. My name is Eleanor. I work at the Office for National Statistics, and we're so pleased to see so many of you join us today for our webinar on environmental statistics. Before we start, all of the webinars in this series will be recorded and will be available on YouTube after the event. You can watch our first webinar, An Introduction to Statistics, on the ONS YouTube channel now. Everyone signed up to this webinar will receive a link once today's recording is available. Given the numbers today, the chat function is closed and all questions will be facilitated through Slido. The Slido number to join will appear on every slide, so don't worry if you miss it. This webinar series is for everyone, so it would be great if you could share on your socials using the hashtag Statistics for the Public Good. Lastly, you will be invited to complete a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we'd really welcome your feedback on this series and the statistics we produce. So the session today is interactive and there will be questions for you to answer, so please join in by going to slido.com and using the number 1171518, or you might find it easier to scan the QR code on the screen, which will take you directly to the site. I'm so pleased to introduce our speakers today, Ellie Martle, Head of Environmental Statistics and Planning at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or some of you may know as Defra. Ellie will talk about measuring the environment at Defra and give you more information about citizen science programmes. From ONS, we are joined by Sonia Carrera, Head of Natural Capital Accounts, who will talk about the environmental statistics we produce at the ONS. I will now hand over to Ellie.
Thank you, Elle. At the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the statistics we produce cover topics like air quality, access to green spaces, biodiversity, recycling and water quality. We work with partner organisations, including the ONS, to produce a wide range of statistics that help to understand our relationship with the environment and our impact on it. The organisations on screen are just a handful of some of the organisations we work with. Because the environment is broad and complex, it can be difficult to measure using traditional data collection techniques. So we have to make use of data from a wide range of sources to produce our statistics. For example, we measure air quality across the UK through networks of monitoring stations, some of which report near real-time data on the concentrations of different pollutants in the air. This can be available to download online from the links on the screen. Perhaps you've walked past one of these strange-looking boxes and wondered what's inside. We also use data reported by local authorities on waste and recycling to calculate England's and local level recycling rates. We also include statistics on fly tipping and other different types of waste issues at local level as well as a national level. Next slide, thanks, Elle. Thank you. A more recent statistic we've been working on is our access to green space statistics. So we use different data sources, for example, from the UK Census, as well as geographical data from the Ordnance Survey to estimate what percentage of households in the UK can reach a green space, such as a park or a nature reserve, within a roughly 15-minute walk from their house. We use network analysis to estimate the shortest distance from each household to the point at which residents can access their nearest green space. There's so much data involved, it takes almost 6 hours for the model to run. We then use these outputs to calculate the percentage of households that are within different distances of different types of green space. And we're currently working on expanding the model to include access to blue space, so for example, rivers and lakes and the sea. Some of our statistics are also reliant on the involvement of members of the public. Natural England, one of our partners, run a national online survey called the People and Nature Survey, which helps us to understand how people engage with the environment. They survey up to 25,000 adults each year, asking questions about people's enjoyment of the environment and how it contributes to their well-being. We also use data captured by citizen scientists to help us understand the state of biodiversity across the UK. So now I've got a question for everyone joining the call. Who can take part in citizen science? So you can vote on your Slido now, and we should hopefully see the results come in vaguely real time. Fab. Ooh, so interesting answers here. I'll give it a couple more seconds for people to put their votes in. can still see some people voting, so I'll give it a little bit longer. So we've got quite a split then across the different ones. So we've been a bit mean here. This is probably a trick question. Oh, sorry, if we could go back on the slide. Everyone can get involved in citizen science. So it is open to members of the public. You don't need to be a scientist by training. You just need to be happy and willing to get involved. And sometimes there's a bit of an overlap between people who work in conservation or ecology, as well as accredited researchers and scientists. So they might want to get involved in their spare time as well, or help facilitate schemes. So everyone, including you on the call, are more than welcome to get involved in citizen science, which are run by various different charities, as well as the government across the UK. So some examples of some citizen science schemes up on the screen now. So there's you can get involved in the breeding bird survey, bee walks, butterfly monitoring schemes, dormouse monitoring, insect trapping, you name it, and there's probably a citizen science scheme out there for you to get involved with. They measure, as I mentioned, a whole range of wildlife, including mammals, birds and insects, and generally have different levels of involvement. So it can be anything from 15 minutes of your time to a more involved commitment on behalf of the citizen scientists. So one of these surveys, so the UK Breeding Bird Survey, relies on nearly 3,000 volunteers to survey a randomly selected 1 kilometre square each spring 3 times to count all of the birds they see and record any nests they come across. Some volunteers choose to revisit their 1 kilometre square later in the season to record butterfly counts as well. And the big butterfly count, which runs for 3 weeks every year, involves counting butterflies seen in a space that the volunteer picks for just 15 minutes. So this sort of demonstrates the sort of different levels of commitment of citizen scientists. In the UK, we use citizen scientists to support our understanding of measuring the populations of species. And the different organisations that run these schemes carry out checks on the data quality and use the data to estimate the size of individual species populations. There's different ways you can measure this, and we generally use 2 measures. One which is abundance, which refers to the number of any species present, and one called distribution, which refers to how widespread the species are. So as you can see on the screen, the difference between the 2 types of measures. And then as statisticians in Defra, we're then able to bring the data together from multiple schemes to create what we call composite indicators, which give a sense of how populations of bigger groups of species are doing. We publish these as annual statistics as on the populations of birds, butterflies, mammals, plants, and pollinators. It's not necessarily practical to measure the actual change in the number of species each year, but it is possible to assess their status by calculating the relative change based on the counts captured by our citizen scientists. Next slide, please. Thank you. As you can see from this chart on the UK bird populations, since the data was started to be collected in the 1970s, populations of wild birds have decreased around 15%, so over the last 45 years. The light blue area around the line shows that there is inherent uncertainty in the data, and this level of uncertainty can change year on year depending on all sorts of different factors. For example, how many volunteers were able to get out and collect the data as needed. The fewer volunteers we have, the smaller the samples and the higher the uncertainty in the data. So we've got another Slido question for everyone now. Which group of bird species do you think has seen the greatest fall in population since 1970? This is probably a bit of a harder question unless we've got any keen birders on the call. Oh, interesting. I think we might have some keen birders on the call. So I'll give everyone a second longer to cast their vote. Thank you. If we go to the next slide, we'll be able to see that farmland birds have actually experienced the most dramatic decline since 1970. So they've actually declined by 60%, followed by woodland birds, which face a decline of 37%, whereas some populations of birds, so wintering water bird populations, have actually increased by 38%. It can be useful to break down that bigger indicator into these different groups to get a better understanding of the different trends and to better understand what might be causing some of these declines. So we also have similar citizen science schemes, as I mentioned, set up for butterflies. So for butterfly populations in the UK, we've seen the numbers generally also decline since the start of the 1970s. In this case, the data actually starts from the year 1976, and we know from other studies that 1976 wasn't actually a particularly good year for butterflies. It was quite a normal year population-wise at that time. However, since then, populations haven't recovered. In 1976, there was a severe drought, and it's throughout all of this time since, the populations haven't recovered to the previous levels. This trend is also similar to what we see for pollinating insects, bats, and plants across the UK. And trends like these are used by policymakers, government agencies, and non-governmental organisations to understand the effects of environmental management, such as changes in agricultural practices or woodland management on wildlife. The trends are also used to assess the effectiveness of environmental interventions intended to address declines, such as agri-environmental schemes designed at particular groups of species. Recently, we've also produced a single indicator to measure changes in abundance of nearly 1,200 species of mammals, birds, insects, and plants and invertebrates. This will be used to help us understand whether or not the government is on track to halt and reverse the decline in species abundance by 2042, which is a legal target. You can see from this chart the trend in species abundance has declined substantially since 1970 to around 69% of its starting value, or a decline of 31%. In this chart, as you'll see, there's two different lines. For these two different lines, we've applied different methods of smoothing. So for option 1, we've used a greater degree of smoothing to provide a better view of the long-term trend in the data. And for option 2, we've used a lesser degree of smoothing to preserve the shorter-term patterns. Smoothing is applied to reveal the long-term trends in otherwise noisy data. So when you've got 1,200 species in your data set, that's a lot of noise. So this helps us to more clearly see the patterns over the long term. As we're still developing this indicator, we're interested in getting users' feedback for which options they find more useful to them, and are currently taking feedback on that as well. So if you do have any feedback, please get in touch with our team. There'll be details at the end of the presentation. So while we as statisticians can apply complicated methods to generate trends and charts, this is meaningless without good data. And as you've hopefully seen today, this just wouldn't be possible without the time, effort of thousands of volunteers and of citizen scientists across the UK, and we wouldn't be able to have the rich understanding of the status of biodiversity and wildlife that we do. So thank you to our many citizen scientists. And now I'm going to hand over to Sonia from the ONS, who's going to take you through the next part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today. I'm Sonia Carrera, and I'm head of the Natural Capital Accounts here at the ONS, and I will tell you a bit more about the statistics on the environment that we produce here at ONS. As you might have understood from the previous presentation, we're not the only one making statistics about the environment in the UK. The statistics are produced across central, devolved, and local government. The unique role of the ONS in developing these statistics is that we measure the interaction between the environment and both the economy and society. And although the language can be a bit technical, as it is for our GDP, which is a measure of the economy that many of you may know, we follow international standards similarly for the environment and for the economy to show how the environment is contributing to the economy. So, for example, raw materials and the impact that the economy is having on the environment. So, for example, the emissions of greenhouse gases through energy use and air pollution. And also how society is responding to environmental issues. For example, through environmental taxes and for how much businesses spend on environmental protection. Our natural capital accounts focus on services provided by ecosystems, while our environmental accounts focus on the economic activity and the pressures on the environment that it generates. So I will start by telling you a little bit more about the natural capital accounts. And if we can move a couple of slides forward, please. The estimates of economic value of our natural wealth are included in the natural capital accounts, and also what it could provide for current and future generations. Any natural resource or process that supports human life, society, and the economy is very important as a part of these accounts. That includes, for example, nature's ability to sequester carbon dioxide, the production and the productivity from our soil, the species that inhabit our environment, water quality, or the access and the benefits that people can derive from spending time in green spaces. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we want to put a price on nature. This is very important because help us recognize and valuing nature and also making important decisions both in policy and the economy. And we tend to produce these accounts at the UK level, but also for the 4 nations that make up the UK. While these accounts are not part of GDP, as it is currently measured, they also help answer important questions and making decisions on the relationship between the economy, society, and the environment. We follow international standards, and the standards for these accounts are set by the UN in a system that is called System of Environmental Economic Accounting, which has more than 80 countries implementing it. And this is important because it means that the statistics produced using this system are also comparable between different countries at the international level. These accounts are divided and organized into 4 parts, as we can see in the next slide. So first of all, we measure what we call extent, which means the area covered by each habitat. And then we look at the condition, which means tracking the ecological health of each habitat. We then look at the physical accounts. That is the flows of services from our natural assets. And then we look at the monetary value that selected ecosystem services produce annually, and also overall as evaluation of the ability of those assets to generate this flow of value in future. And these are called monetary accounts. The UK natural capital accounts are also assigned to 8 broad habitats. And thinking about the services that we attribute to these accounts and to these habitats to be able to measure the value, we can think about these services as falling into 3 different types. Provisioning, that means the products that are extracted, harvested or derived from nature. So they include, for example, the food that we can produce from nature, water, energy and materials such as wood, for example. Then we have regulating services. These are services that help maintaining the quality of the environment. So, for example, the air pollution that trees provide. And finally, we have cultural services. These are all those non-material benefits that we can derive from nature and that are produced by ecosystems. So, for example, health benefits, but also the value from tourism and recreation, or the value that green spaces can add to our houses when we live near a park, for example. So let's take a look at woodlands as an example. If we think about the services that we derive from woodlands, some of these fall into provisioning services. So that can be the wood from cutting trees, but also the fruits that we can pick from trees. We then have regulating services, and that includes, for example, the protection from floods, that trees give us, or the sequestration of CO2 from the atmosphere. And then we have cultural services. These are some of those values that I was defining as being non-material. So, for example, the recreation, spending time in nature, in a forest, for example, or the aesthetic values of trees along the street. So as you can see, the value of woodlands comes from much more than just the wood. And we estimated that UK woodlands are worth about 23 times more than the value from just the provisioning services, such as timber and wood fuel. And the additional value comes from all the other services that I've just described. So wood is just a small part of the value that woodlands give us. And then now that I explained how natural capital accounts are produced, and before I give you some of these numbers, if we go to the next slide, there is one more question for you, which is, what do you think are our estimated value of assets of the natural capital services in the UK for 2021? And you have a few options to choose from. So the estimated value of the natural capital services, of the assets from natural capital services in 2021 was 1.5 trillion. As you can see, this is a very large figure. And I think it's worth explaining what this means. When we talk about natural capital assets, we mean the value that are expected to be produced by natural resources over time. So it's not exactly the same, but you can think of it, for example, as the value of your house. But then we can also look at this value in a different way, just looking at the flow of services throughout a year, which is what we see in the next slide. And this shows that in 2021, the total annual value of the ecosystem services provided by nature was 47 billion. So although this is still a very large figure, it's not as big as the one of the assets. And again, this is not exactly the same, but you can think of this as the income that you could get from renting your house for a year. So it is a bit different from the assets that I described before. And then thinking about the importance of these statistics, we can look at the impact that they can have on making decisions for policymakers. So our statistics, for example, help colleagues across government in making policy decisions. An example of this is that the value of urban natural capital and health benefits of green spaces, as measured by our statistics, has supported the policy rationale for improving access to green spaces and Natural England National Green Infrastructure Framework that was set out. So this is one of the ways in which our statistics can help making decisions. But overall, the natural capital is also a very important indicator of the value of the UK nature for the economy and how policies can help protecting and enhancing it, because we can also track them over time and see how they have changed. And as Ali said, citizen science is very important in producing statistics, not only for Defra, but also for the ONS. And in particular, it can help us measure the conditions of different habitats as part of our natural capital accounts. So, for example, condition indicators help us to understand the relationship between an ecosystem condition and the ecosystem services that they deliver by linking this information to measure the economy and human activity. So looking at woodlands, again, as an example, we use data from many sources to estimate the composition and the diversity of the ecological communities at a given location and time. So an example of these are bees and bats data, which are derived from citizen science. And looking at BeeWalk, which is one of the examples that were mentioned earlier, we received data from BeeWalk, as we can see in the next slide, as they are collected through citizen science on bees population across Great Britain. And they feed into our woodland ecosystem condition statistics. How does BeeWalk works? Basically, volunteers survey a fixed route once a month between March and October, and they record the abundance of each bumblebee species that they see, and then submit these data through the BeeWalk website. The outputs from BeeWalk that analyze the data that they receive from citizens then are passed on to us and are widely used to inform our statistics, as well as informing policy and conservation interventions across Great Britain. So this is just an example of how we can use citizens' data to produce our statistics. And then if we move to the next slide, I will cover the last part of the presentation for this webinar, where I'm going to talk a bit more widely about other ONS environmental and climate statistics. First of all, let's have another question. Who do you think produces measures of UK greenhouse gases emission? And you have three options here. So I can see the answers coming through quite close to each other, actually. I think the number seems to be setting. And so the answer is that all three of these departments do. So the majority of you voted for the Department for Environmental Security and Net Zero. And yes, they do produce greenhouse gas emission statistics on a territorial basis. That means the emissions that occur within the UK national borders. And these are also the statistics that are used for meeting our net zero targets, for example. At the ONS, we produce statistics on a residence base, which means emissions by UK residents and UK registered businesses wherever they are in the world. So, for example, emissions produced by UK businesses that have got an overseas part of their business. And then finally, our colleagues at Defra produce these statistics on a consumption basis, which means emissions from the consumptions of all goods and services by the UK. And sometimes this is also referred as the carbon footprint. Looking at some of these emission statistics that we produce at the ONS, UK greenhouse gas emissions on a residence basis were down 3.8% in 2023 compared to 2022. And we also produce emissions per unit of economic activity as an indicator of how the economy is greening. So whether the intensity of these emissions is going up or down. And these have been going down by 71% in the last 30 years, pretty much from 1999. A key use of these measures that it helps us make a direct comparison of emissions by sectors of the UK industry and by households with other key economic indicators. And then if we move to the next slide, we also look at a number of statistics, part of the environmental accounts. These help us understand, for example, how much turnover and employment there is in the low carbon and renewable energy business. We can see the employment in wind power, for example, is increasing over time. And now this can compare with employment across the wider economy. And we can also get some information on how the economy affects the environment. So most obviously, for example, on how much CO2 equivalent is emitted by each industry in the UK economy. And lastly, we can also see how our society and economy respond to this. For example, how businesses spend, how much businesses spend on environmental protection measures, like wastewater treatment, for example, or how governments use taxation to address environmental issues. And then we also have some statistics on the what we can call the green economy. So one measure of this is the low carbon and renewable energy economy, which you can see at a turnover up by 73% between 2015 and 2022, and employment up by 36%. That means that it was almost a third bigger in 2022 compared to 7 years before. We also look at a wider measure of employment in environmental related activities, which is what we call green jobs. And we published recently figures of green jobs, which include employment in any activity that contributes to protecting or restoring the environment, including those that mitigate or adapt to climate change. So this is based on a classification that we make based on different industries, occupations, or what certain businesses and firms produce. So it's a wider measure. And we estimated that in 2022, there were nearly 640,000 full-time equivalent jobs in this category of green jobs, which is a fairly big number, and we can only expect this number to grow, as we're seeing for some of our measures of employment in the green economy. Right. Finally, we also asked some questions to both businesses and citizens about their opinions, attitudes, and actions around the environment. One of these questions that we ask in the opinion and lifestyle survey is also one for you here to answer on Slido. So what do you think are the important issues facing the UK today? And you can choose among quite a few choices here, amongst which you can see that there is climate change and the environment, but there are many others. I think I might have biased you a little bit by mentioning it. I wouldn't be a good survey interviewer if I was to do that as a job. Or maybe those who join our seminars are obviously particularly interested in this topic. Right, so we had a very big number of you saying that climate change and the environment was the main issue for you. That is quite a bit higher than in our survey across the entirety of the population. So based on the latest data that we published last Friday, we found that nearly 60% of adults, 58% to be precise, in Great Britain, so climate change and the environment as an important issue. And we ask this question monthly, and we also use the same survey to explore actions taken to help tackle climate change or reasons for inaction at the same time, and whether respondents had made any lifestyle changes to help tackle climate change or support the environment. We also use our Rapid Business Insights and Conditions survey, which is a survey that we ask businesses on a regular basis to help us understand some of the challenges that UK businesses face in relation to the environment, and also some of their actions. So, for example, some of the questions that we ask are about the concerns around the impact that climate change can have on their business and some of the practical actions that they have taken to reduce emissions. So with these statistics about opinions, I have come to the end of this presentation. I am very thankful to all of you who have taken part, and I think we have time now for questions and answers.
Fab, thanks Sonia, thank you Ellie, some really interesting presentations. So we're now going to move into the questions section. So we've got around 10 minutes for questions. We are using a thumbs up system, so if you go on Slido, please like the questions that you would like answered the most, and we'll go through those first. All questions will be answered through Slido. So I noticed there was a hand up earlier. If you could please ask your questions through Slido, and we'll get those through. So the first question is, do you measure the quality of the green space, poor quality space and high quality space impacting health and well-being? So Ellie, I'll go to you first for that one.
Thanks for this question. I think it's a really good one. And before I get into it, actually, it's worth saying that this is also one of our official statistics in development. So we're also seeking feedback on it as well. So please do get in touch with us if you do have any suggestions for the indicator. So we don't currently measure the quality of green space in the indicator, but what we do is we produce a variety of estimates based on different sort of green space standards and different types of green space. So whether it's a park, whether it's a right of way and that kind of thing. So that's sort of a different way that's broken down. So if you look at our page on gov.uk where these statistics are published, you'll see the different types, and actually the numbers, the distance, the average distance can vary quite a lot depending on what type of green space and how we classify the green spaces. I think that's a really good question.
Thanks, Ellie. I'll go on to the next question, and this is from Tudor. Thanks, Tudor. With citizen scientists, the data collection process is presumably outside your control. How do you cope with or mitigate data quality issues?
Thanks. This is also a really good question. So actually, it's probably a bit of a misnomer for me to say that we cope with the data quality issues, because actually this is something that's generally handled by our partner organisations that do run the surveys. However, there's a few different things that they will do to help with it. So for a start, at the beginning of the data collection progress, they do a lot to mitigate and make it as easy as possible for our citizen scientists to provide them with high quality data. So whether that will be really clear instructions. If you sign up for things like the Big Garden Bird Watch, you can get a printout sheet with the common garden birds that you might identify and things like that. But once the data is collected, these different organisations will do a variety of data cleaning methods, and you looking at things like bringing in weather data and other sources of data to help validate and explain some of the trends that they're seeing as well. And you can sort of look at things that are sort of maybe not likely to have turned up in that place. If it's a rare butterfly and somewhere where that's very much not expected, is that a one-off? Should that be removed from the data set and things like that? But you'll be actually really surprised at the level of expertise we have amongst citizen scientists. They a lot of people are genuine experts and really good at identifying different species, as well as going right down to beginners. And generally, the charities and the organisations involved do a really great job of setting people up, whether you're a beginner or a sort of armchair expert, of getting involved and collecting some really useful data. But yeah, it varies depending on which survey and which one it is, depending on the different techniques used will vary depending on which scheme is the one involved.
Excellent, thank you, Ellie. So the next question is, so if I was worried about global warming, where would I go to see data which might help understand what is happening?
So there are many sources that you can consult. The Met Office is actually producing some very interesting analysis on the impact of global warming, and that is a source that I would recommend, but I would suggest to look at different sources. So definitely you can look at some of our analysis here at ONS. I've also looked at the relationship between the environment and health. And you could also look at some of the statistics brought from Defra and from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sonia. Next question is, how do you communicate abundance data to landowners, farmers, etc., to explain the need to increase populations?
Thanks, Elle. So through a variety of ways. Well, firstly, as statisticians, we follow the code of practice, and a big part of that is engaging with our users and asking for feedback on our indicators. So landowners would be very much part of that group that we're interested in hearing from and getting feedback in. In other parts of Defra, we've got teams developing environmental land management schemes, and both going into the design of these schemes is the data that we use, but that is also used to communicate to farmers and help explain some of the changes that will be made and help ensure that our farming schemes are evidence-based and based on our statistics. We also try and provide context in our publications around the data, around the changes in practice we think are driving them, and all of our publications we aim to make as user-friendly as possible, so you don't have to be a government statistician or an ecologist to understand our publications as well. So, and again, would really welcome any feedback from anyone on how accessible they find these publications.
Absolutely. Brilliant, thank you. The next one is, how has the data provided been used to inform policy or changes? Are there any examples of positive outcomes that have come from this?
Some examples, actually, Ellie might be better placed to give, but as far as I know, some of our ONS data have been used by Defra to make some policy decisions. So, for example, data on the overall asset value of the UK natural capital is an important indicator of the strategic value of the UK, of nature in the UK, and has been used to feed into the environment improvement plan that was published by the previous government. And the ONS accounts on urban natural capital that I mentioned earlier in relation to health benefits of green spaces have informed some of the decision from Natural England on national green infrastructure framework. But we don't make policy ourselves here at ONS, we just produce the statistics.
Thanks, Sonia. I think that's some really good examples. So on the Defra side, we also use evidence to help design our environmental improvement plan, and it often forms the sort of start often of the policy discussions. I think some good examples of where we're using it have been around also the development of our Environment Act targets. So evidence is used to design stretching targets that will hold government to account on improving the environment, and so there's quite a lot online if people are interested in specific examples in that space, but off the top of my head there's sort of stretching ones in the sort of air quality space, where there's been a lot of work and evidence going into developing stretching targets, and then that's used to justify policies, support and support funding and interest, and help ministers make decisions on these kind of really important topics.
Thank you both. I think we've got time for 2 more questions. So how can people volunteer to become citizen scientists?
I'm happy to respond to this, and actually I think I can link to the next question as well, which has, will the slide be provided afterwards? The link is in the fact that to volunteer you can sign up to many different organizations that produce this data. And in the presentation that we will share, so the answer is yes, we will share the presentation after. There is a list of different organizations, which is not inclusive of all the organizations, but is just an example of some of the organizations that you could sign up to provide your data. So that is some of those that Elias mentioned, such as Butterfly Count, Bat Count, the Bee Walk that I described in the slides, and there are quite a few more also for trees and for wildflowers as well, as far as I'm aware.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sonia. You've answered my question. I was going to mention about the slides, and this recording will go on YouTube and the ONS website after the event. So just more few slides to finish off. So there are upcoming environmental releases to the end of 2024. So all of these links will be provided in an email after the event, or you can go to Defra or the ONS release calendar. We do have more upcoming webinars in the series. So we have prices on the 21st of November and health on the 12th of December. We'll also have other topics that you can register for in December that will be hosted throughout 2025. They'll cover such things as population, crime, and misuse of statistics. You can follow us on Eventbrite or sign up to a webinar the same way that you signed up to this session today. So lastly, we just want to get a bit of feedback from you today, how you've enjoyed this webinar, if there's any feedback that you'd like to give us. But I'd like just to say thank you to Ellie and Sonia for your presentations today, and also thank you to everyone for joining today. Please go to slido.com, number 1171518 to fill out the feedback form. But thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you all.